Hi, my name is Lane. Hi. I'm reading 1 Corinthians 18 through 25. Please stand if you're able. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to those who believe, or to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews, and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Lane. Nice work. I changed the passage on Lane like 3 times this week, so he did a good job going with me. And Liz, thank you for sharing your story with us and letting us know what Jesus has done through you and through his cross in your life. It's really neat to see. It's been fun to watch that whole journey. So Lane read for us about the foolishness of the gospel, about the folly, or what seems like folly of the wisdom of God. And one of the very first physical depictions or drawings of Jesus, I don't know if you've ever seen this before, it was one of the very first visual depictions of Jesus, was done in about 200, so early 3rd century, late 2nd century, just 150, 170 years after Jesus died. And here it is. You can see it? It's actually, you can't see it very well. You can actually go online and look at it. And I'll show you actually what it is in just a second. It's really hard to see. It's actually a scraping in like a stucco wall found in a house in Italy. And it was graffiti, basically. So some kid sitting in the bathroom stall carving on the wall is basically what it was. And it was a picture of Jesus. And here's somebody kind of etched it out or drew it out to show what it actually is. It's a picture of a man on a cross, crucified, with a donkey's head. And there's a man standing by him, praying or worshiping to him with the words in Greek, which roughly are translated, Alexamenos, which is the name of this man apparently, Alexamenos worships his God. And the implication of this graffiti is that to worship someone who was crucified is akin to worshiping an ass. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. And to most humans, the gospel is complete and utter foolishness. And those who believe it deserve nothing less than to be mocked and to be made fun of. And in this account that we're going to read today of Jesus' suffering, where we're at today in Matthew chapter 27, I'd encourage you to turn there and follow along with us. But in this account of Jesus' suffering, we have Jesus clearly depicted in this account as king. He's crowned, he's enthroned, and he receives his subjects at his court and received by his subjects at his court. But all of this picture of Jesus being crowned and enthroned as king is a twisted, mocking picture. It is a parody, a lampoon or a satire of kingship. We read this and we should be asking, what kind of king is this? And the answer, honestly, should shock us, and I think that's part of the purpose of this story. And we begin with the king's coronation. A coronation is a ceremony in which a ruler is crowned. So you think about England, and you think about King Charles, who was recently crowned, and long before him, his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, who was coronated, and a crown was put on her head, and there was all this pomp and circumstances, and many people watching, and lots of money spent, and lavish attire. For us Americans who don't have kings, it's kind of like a presidential inauguration, right? A time when someone in authority is given that authority in a formal manner. But the coronation of King Jesus is, in the story that we read, nothing but a joke to all who are present. So Matthew chapter 27, we're going to start today at verse 27. It says, "Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' They spit on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him." This is a coronation, but it's a mock coronation. So we have here Roman soldiers, the governor's soldiers, and these men would not have necessarily been loved by the Jews, and likely they didn't have much affection for the Jewish population that surrounded them. In fact, in the context of this story, it's very likely that some of their colleagues, some of their friends, some of their fellow soldiers had recently been attacked, even murdered and killed by an insurrectionist by the name of Barabbas. So what better way for soldiers to blow off some steam and channel out their pent-up aggression than to have some fun with this prisoner? Right? A seemingly ridiculous backwoods rabbi from Galilee who claimed to be the king of the Jews. And we read, if you look a verse up in verse 26, in passing it tells us that Jesus had been scourged before he had been handed over to be crucified. And basically what that means is that Jesus had been whipped with a cat o' nine tails, tied naked to a post or something similar, and hit 39 times on the back with a leather whip. And embedded in the leather of that whip would have been pieces of bone and metal to do the utmost damage to the back. And as a result of this gruesome beating, his back would have been raw, it would have been completely open, gushing with blood. And he's in this pitiful state. He's likely barely conscious. He's lost a lot of blood. He's in shock. The soldiers in charge of carrying out his death sentence take him into the governor's palace, and they call all the men out, about 600 men in this battalion. And it says that first they stripped Jesus completely of his now bloodied clothing, which further would have humiliated him as he's naked in public. Then they take one of their robes, a scarlet robe that a soldier would have worn, and because it's the only one that they would have had on hand, and they wrapped it around him as if he were royalty. But if you're at a coronation, a king doesn't just need a robe, he needs a crown, a proper crown. So one of the soldiers perhaps finds a bush, a rose bush or something similar with thorns, cuts off a few branches and weaves them together to create this intricate crown for a ridiculous king. And not only is the crown kind of a laughable parody of something more regal, but it's also painful. Made from the branches of a thorn bush, which when pushed down would press into the skin, into the scalp, and cause more bleeding into the eyes. And then finally, to complete his regal ensemble, the soldiers take a stick, nothing more than a bent reed, and they put it in his hand. This king needs a scepter if he's going to rule. And before them now stands a pathetic, laughable version of a true king. A tragic, bleeding, weak mockery of true royalty. This man is nothing like Caesar. He's not royal at all. He's dripping with blood. He's barely able to stand. He's beaten and battered. He's powerless and he's suffering. And then in mock reverence, some of the soldiers put on a show with laughter probably, and they bow before him, crying out, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And at the same time, others in disgust, maybe in anger, spit in his face, and some take the reed or the stick out of his hands and with an act of physical violence use his own scepter to beat the crown of thorns deeper into his brow. Now, when we think of Jesus' suffering, when we think of his crucifixion, we quickly, even as I've done in my explanation, we kind of focus on the physical elements of it, don't we? A brutal scourging, a beating, being mistreated, having nails embedded in his hands and his feet, the suffocation that comes when you're crucified. But we don't often focus on the physical and the spiritual and the mental and the social suffering that Jesus was forced to endure. But that's actually where the gospel writers take us. They don't give us much physical detail at all. They focus on the shame that Jesus endured. The entire narrative draws our attention mainly to Jesus' shame. Shame that is expressed through verbal mockery, through reviling, through derision. In fact, that is one of the very things that Jesus anticipated. It's one of the things he predicted as a part of his sufferings when he told his disciples back in Matthew 20. He said to them, "See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified." Now, to mock means to ridicule, to belittle, to make, in our modern parlance, would be to make fun of somebody, to taunt them or revile someone. So rather than physical weapons, mockery uses words as implements of violence, as weapons to destroy and tear down, and piles on verbal dishonor and shame on someone. So for Jesus, for these Roman soldiers, for Jesus to be king is nothing more than a joke. But the irony is that Jesus really is the king. And he's not just any king, he's the great king. He's the king above all kings. He is the king of kings. And perhaps most importantly of all, he is the suffering king. Because remember, as we pointed out before, Jesus, through this whole narrative, Jesus is in control. This is the coronation he has chosen. The coronation of suffering. Now, the next step for a newly crowned king, now that he's received his crown, is to ascend to his throne, to sit up on his royal seat, which is what takes place next, starting in verse 32. Where it says, "As they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, and they compelled this man to carry his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink, mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots, or throwing dice. Then they sat down and kept watch over him there, and over his head they put the charge against him, which read, 'This is Jesus, the King of the Jews.' Then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left." So having crowned King Jesus, these soldiers now lead him away. They put his own clothes back on him, and they have a grisly royal parade to the place of his enthronement, which is a place called Golgotha, or place of a skull. It might have looked like a skull. There may have been many skulls there. There sure was a lot of death that took place there. And those who were crucified were often made to carry their own crossbeam, which was the cross part. What is that? Horizontal. The horizontal part of the cross. And then when they got to the side, it would be attached to a permanent upright post. But Jesus was in a bad state. He couldn't carry it for some reason because he'd been beaten. He's bleeding out. And so the soldiers find, as their legal right to do, they find a man and they force him to carry this cross for him. And the man's name's Simon, and he is from northern Africa. Now, when we hear the name Simon, we should instantly be reminded of another man named Simon. We know him as Peter. And Peter had earlier refused to Jesus' face any idea of a cross being part of Jesus' story. So go back to Matthew chapter 16, and you may recall this encounter between Jesus and Peter, where Jesus, for the first time, tells his disciples, beginning to show them that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the third day be raised. And then it says, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, rebuking Jesus, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Peter could never imagine a suffering Messiah. And he was dead set, aggressively dead set against Jesus' suffering. Yet Jesus was adamant with his disciples. He said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." So the Simon who was uncomfortable with, even as we saw a few weeks ago, even scandalized by the cross, was also the Simon who wasn't there. He was absent. This is the Simon who had fled. This is the Simon who just a few hours before had denied that he even knew Jesus. He was nowhere to be found as Jesus ascended to his throne. So another Simon has to come and take his place. Another Simon was chosen and forced to take up his cross and follow Jesus. There may just be a little lesson here that we take away from this. The fact is that if we don't follow Jesus in the way that he's called to follow him, he may find someone else to do it for us. Now, the text here gives very little detail about the crucifixion itself. After he refuses this bitter wine laced with gall that possibly was a narcotic to help with the pain, he refuses it. They offer it to him. The text simply says in verse 35, when they had crucified him. That's it. No details. And if you were in the first century reading this, you would know exactly what was happening. For us, we need a little bit more explanation. Again, the focus, though, isn't on Jesus' physical suffering, but on the spiritual, emotional, social suffering, the shame that he had to endure. But another thing that the story draws our attention to is the way in which Jesus' sufferings perfectly fulfill the Scripture. For instance, this story perfectly echoes the lament of David from Psalm chapter 22. When David writes in verse 16, he says, "For dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." And Gentiles in the first century Israel, Gentiles were often called by Jews, they were called dogs. So for dogs to encompass Jesus was for non-Jews, like these Roman soldiers, to surround and encircle him. And they had literally just finished piercing his hands and feet to attach him to his cross. And now, having done that grisly task, they do exactly what Psalm 22 predicts. They take his clothing, they throw dice, they cast lots, and they divide it amongst themselves. Jesus' death perfectly fulfills what God had planned, and what God had foreseen, what God had prophesied. And now Jesus also, as he's hanging on the cross, it says he had a charge placed above his head. And what that means is that they're basically posting, this is the reason that this man is undergoing the death sentence. This is the reason for his explanation. This is a public explanation. And the sign simply said, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." In other words, a public declaration by the Roman governor that this is the king. He is being enthroned right now before you. And we have two robbers who are also crucified with Jesus, one on the right side and one on the left. And you might remember earlier in the gospel when the mother of two of Jesus' disciples, James and John, had approached Jesus. This is back in John 20. She approached Jesus on behalf of her sons, asking for a favor. And she asked Jesus that her two sons would have the privilege of taking the places of honor in Jesus' kingdom. When he was enthroned, that they would be on his right and on his left. And in Matthew 20, verse 22, Jesus looked at her two boys, and she said to them, "You do not know what you are asking." And he then asked them, "Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" To which they foolishly replied, "We are able." Jesus then knowingly responded to them, "You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant. It is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." As we've already seen several weeks ago, the cup that Jesus was to drink was the cup of trembling. It was the cup of God's wrath that was poured out on sin. And he's now hanging on this cross, drinking fully from that terrible cup of God's wrath. So to take and drink Jesus' cup, which he offers to his disciples, to take and drink his cup is to share in his sufferings. But just like Simon Peter, James and John, these confident disciples were nowhere to be seen. The only people on Jesus' right hand and his left hand, the only one occupying these places of honor are these two thieves. And the ironic picture, of course, is that when King Jesus is enthroned, it isn't on a glorious throne in Jerusalem. It's on an instrument of torture outside the city walls. He's enthroned in dishonor and shame, fully drinking the cup of God's wrath. So even though they have no idea what they're doing, those who crucify Jesus are acting out his true enthronement. His enthronement of suffering. Remember, Jesus is completely in control. This is the enthronement he has chosen. This is the way that he becomes king. And friend, when you read this passage, everything about this passage shouts, "King." Do we understand? Do you understand what it means for Jesus to be king? Do you understand what it means to follow this king? But Jesus' sufferings are not yet over. As the newly enthroned king on his throne, the cross, between these two criminals, he now receives, as a king or a queen would as they sit on their throne, he now receives his royal court, his admirers, his well-wishers. But even as the king would receive all of them with open arms, he is received with mockery, with derision, with revilement, starting in verse 38. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he desires him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. So we have three groups who are now mocking Jesus. The general public passing by on their way to and from Jerusalem who deride him. They wag their heads or they shake their heads at him. The religious leaders, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders who come and openly mock him before everyone. And then we have these two thieves, those crucified with Jesus on his right and his left, in these places of honor, beginning to revile him as well. And again, we have a perfect fulfillment of Psalm 22. Verse 6, it says, "I am scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in Yahweh. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him." These are almost the exact words that these leaders have spoken. And just as Satan had done back in Matthew chapter 4 when he's tempting Jesus, the onlookers question Jesus' identity. They say, "If you are the Son of God, if you are the Son of God, then come down from that cross." And their assumption is that the Son of God would never hang on a cross. That the Son of God would never allow himself to be treated so shamefully. That the Son of God would never suffer. That the Son of God would never die. And the King of Israel, the Messiah, would never act like this. And like Peter did earlier, they think the crucifixion is proof that Jesus cannot be who he says he is. He cannot be God's prophet, God's Son, God's Messiah. He cannot suffer. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. Because the reality is that Jesus is doing exactly what the Scriptures have said he would do. It's not the fact that Jesus is hanging on a cross that is proof against who he is. Rather, it's the fact that his hanging there completely fulfills the prophetic word that is proof for who he is. And when Jesus seems very unkingly, he is actually doing the most kingly thing possible. You see, the greater miracle here wouldn't be Jesus coming off the cross. The greatest miracle is Jesus staying on the cross. He's sacrificing himself for others, obeying his Father perfectly, and bringing us salvation. And the truth is that once again, friends, Jesus is in control. This is the reception that Jesus chose. It's the shame that he endured, as Hebrews 12 says, for the joy that was set before him. So I want to just give you a couple pieces of application before we come to the table this morning. Just some maybe thoughts to mull over as we meditate, as we think about Jesus suffering on our behalf as the suffering King who's been crowned, who's been enthroned, and who's been received even by us. And the first is that Jesus' suffering helps us to see that our suffering is never accidental and it always has a purpose. Jesus knows your troubles. Now, Jesus chose his suffering, his mock coronation, this gruesome enthronement, this shameful reception. He chose it all on our account. Now, we don't always choose our suffering. Sometimes we cause it. Not all the time, but we don't always choose our suffering. But Jesus chose his in order not only to save us, but to identify with us. And because of this, Jesus knows whatever you are going through. Especially if you are being mocked or made fun of on his account for his name. We can never say, in front of Jesus, we can never say, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Because Jesus has seen the trouble we know. And why? He's done it so that he could help us in our troubles. As Hebrews again says, therefore, he, Jesus, had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. And life following Jesus will often present us with stumbling blocks and what looks like foolishness. It doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always make sense to us. It doesn't always make sense to others around us. But Jesus has taught us, he's called us to take up our cross. I'm going to read this whole passage in Matthew 16. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? You see, salvation is ironic. The first will be last, the last will be first. The greatest will be servant of all. Life comes through death. And we're called to live in this irony, to embrace it, to embody and proclaim this gospel of the crucified King. And to follow this King, to be a people of the way and the truth and the life, means that we will willingly take up our cross and follow Jesus, even on a road of suffering. And just as he called his disciples to do, there's no hint in this of avoiding suffering. There's no hint of defending ourselves. The hint is to keep your mouth shut and follow Jesus. And as one writer I recently read states, God is committed to my dying every day. And he calls me to that same commitment. But God will not leave me for dead, but will raise me similarly, as he did with Jesus, if I would only allow myself to die. And this is the place where we once again remember, receive, and embrace the gospel of Jesus as we come to the table to remember the one who gave his life in our place. We remember that he chose to have a crown of thorns. He chose to be mocked and ashamed. He chose to hang on a throne that looked like a cross. And one day he will come again to judge the living and the dead, and he will sit on a great throne. And even now he is at the right hand of the throne of God interceding for us. This is the Jesus we serve. This is the Jesus we follow. And today I would just encourage you as you come to the table, if you're a follower of Jesus, this is how we remember and celebrate this very scene each and every week, reminding ourselves of a crucified king, a Savior who loves us and gave himself for us and poured himself out for us. So take some bread and take this juice and just meditate on him. Meditate on his gift to you in his death. We're going to take communion together today, which means just as we have several stations up here and some in the back where you can come and take the bread and the cup and take it back to your seat and just, like I said, just meditate on what you've heard today. Meditate on this passage, this picture of our crucified King, and we'll take communion together in just a few moments. Jesus, we thank you for your utter grace in going to the cross, despising the shame, for the joy that was set before you. And now you're seated at the right hand of the throne of God in the place of power. And you intercede for us as we are suffering. Lord, we thank you. We rejoice as we've been commanded to rejoice in our tribulations. We rejoice in those sufferings, Lord, because they draw us closer to you as you have drawn close to us in your suffering. God, may we know you, may we see you, may we truly worship you, the suffering King. Pray all this in Jesus' name, that you would get the glory. Amen.